Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to the Philosopher's Den, where I am joined by my two esteemed colleagues, Vince and Josh, to discuss more of the end times with Nagash. Now, returning from the polo grounds, I have built up quite a thirst. So with me, I have, of course, my fine glass of scotch, and I will partake of this, perhaps, while the two of you fellows say a fine word about yourselves and introduce yourselves.
Well, I would say that it's very good to be back with you, sir, as always. It's an honor to be in such distinguished company as both of you, fine gentlemen. And I look forward to another evening of rousing discussion about these end of times and how they descend upon us all.
Indeed, I must admit that our last little tete-a-tete was the talk of the house for quite some time afterwards, so I'm looking forward to a repeat of the rousing intellectual discussion from last go-round.
Well, as I'm sure it would be. I mean, when men such of ourselves come together in minds and share our thoughts, it would bound to take precedence over all other things happening in a household. So let us commence with a brief catch-up on what we've covered already, and that is that in the prior episode, we simply ran the gamut of the Warhammer world and explained to the populace about all of the happenings at the beginning of the end times narrative as to what is going on with all the races in the world. So now that we have laid out the players and the pieces on the table, we will then delve into the development of what is happening. Now, the key plots that are opening up here is Mannfred and Arkhan are the two primary minions of Nagash, with the aims on returning the great necromancer to the Warhammer world. Okay. So, within that, there's a couple of key points that we have to lay down, and it mainly begins with a focus on Manfred. So Manfred, as he has settled into Sylvania and his castle of Sternesti, has been bound by Balthasar Gelt and his wall of faith around the province of Sylvania. Early on, Manfred notes something very particular about that, and that is that it seems properties that will allow entry into Sylvania but bars any exit from Sylvania. So he finds himself a little bit trapped. Now, one of the things that he crafts here as a counter, or a countermeasure, temporarily at least, is he himself uses his own magics within Sylvania to craft a wall of bone to keep those out. Now, curiously, when we come upon the first encounter of this chapter, there is a presence of a necromancer that enters into his realm and doesn't seem to be bothered either by that wall of faith nor that wall of bone, and he manages to bypass it. Unlike others who have entered his realm in the meantime, Manfred recognizes that this particular being radiates a great power that he deems requires his personal attendance. So, perhaps, Josh, would you pick it up from here and explain who this great necromancer may be?
Well, absolutely. The thing I think is very interesting that we find out in this chapter before the reveal of this necromancer is he is very open with what he has come seeking. A crown, a severed hand, and 7 books of blood-inked flesh is specifically what it says. Now, this immediately puts Manfred on the defensive, because not only does he recognize the power of these objects, but he understands that he himself has used these relics of Nagash recently to create the eternal darkness that is currently cloaking Sylvania. So, obviously, Manfred, who is the master of this eternal darkness within Sylvania, demands why he should give up his rightful property to this vagabond who's entered his home. And rather than identifying himself, the mysterious necromancer says 3 words: Nagash must rise. And it is that command of the voice of the name of Nagash that instantly reveals to Manfred that he is facing Arkhan the Black, first of the 9 Dark Lords, who is the only one, as Manfred puts it, who would have the audacity to undertake such a quest.
Mm-hmm.
So immediately, Manfred realizes that he must do away with Arkhan, and launches a powerful bolt of darkness at him, which Arkhan laughs away. This begins an epic battle on the Valsborg Bridge, where the two powerful necromancers hurl everything they have at each other. Every corpse drug up, claiming battle, dire wolves, bats from the sky, magics that both have built over centuries. And it is none of these things that undoes Manfred. In fact, he appears to be winning through most of the battle because Arkhan has challenged the Master at his very doorstep. But it is simple sunlight. Manfred, in drawing upon these powers to smote his enemy, draws on the spells that he's created to shroud his land in darkness, and a single shaft of sunlight bursts through the clouds. And in that moment of primal fear, Manfred realizes that this battle cannot be won through pure force. Because if he smotes Arkhan here, he would have to draw upon the very magics that are protecting him from the accursed sun. And so an uneasy truce is set between the two that Manfred plans to ultimately use to his own benefit. And I personally think this is an amazing scene because, particularly if one has read the text before this, the Sigmar's Blood, Manfred had been built up as almost an impossible to defeat evil. And in what is 2 columns of text, he is humbled to make way for Nagash and the plans of the great necromancer, but is still shown to maintain a cunning and a forethought that still makes him a very dangerous enemy and a very dangerous character in this narrative.
Yeah, I think that this scene here reveals very much an important view of the characters of both of these people. So before we move on to any other development of the narrative, I think it's worth a bit of a discussion about what we know about the character of Manfred. Vince, do you have any thoughts on that fellow?
Yeah, absolutely. Manfred considers himself the absolute master of his realm, and beyond that, like sort of a master of much more if he could have it. It's really to him not a matter of if but when. And I think if he has a single defining quality, it's his arrogance. And that absolutely gets borne out here, both in this fight and even in Arkhan's own internal thoughts, as after the sort of battle is through, Arkhan even remarks to himself internally that he's shocked that that Manfred couldn't see how clear Arkhan's thoughts are. Only someone who was sort of blindingly arrogant could not perceive them. At the same time, Arkhan does admit openly that Manfred's powers are troublingly great, and that it's best not to underestimate him. And he sort of makes this devil's bargain of keeping his enemy, his enemy closer, as it were. And I think ultimately what that comes down to at sort of the end is Manfred immediately switches gears and formulates this big plan of, yes, Nagash would rise, but Manfred will get all the power. Either he'll subjugate Nagash or take Nagash's power, or he has lots of different possibilities in his head, but one of those is how he wants to see this play out. He sort of plans to puppet master Arkhan to then steal this great power he sees on the horizon.
And I personally think that these two characters are perfect for that point. Particularly if we look at the archetypes involved, you're facing the archetype of the master in Manfred in that arrogance, versus that of the servant in Arkhan. As powerful as Arkhan has ever been, he has, from the first writings in the Tomb King's texts, he is but a servant. He is the herald of the darkness that is to come. And I think it's perfect to show that sort of powerlessness in the face of Nagash, that it is not Nagash himself that brings Manfred to heel, but it is a trusted servant. And I thought it was an excellent build-up point for where we know this conflict is going to go once Nagash gets introduced to it.
I did find exactly that very interesting, that Manfred, who believes he's the master of his realm, and he has this vagabond, as you put it, who comes in to impress upon Manfred and make some demands. Manfred reluctantly agrees because he recognizes the power that he opposes. Yet, he still believes that he's in full control, and he is going to just play along until I get the opportunity to snatch the power right at the key moment. And Arkhan is a smart enough fellow who's been around for millennia to see right through that and knows exactly Manfred's mind, that he has all these intentions, but is a tool that Arkhan needs to pursue the ultimate goal.
Agreed.
So being a good servant, yet he still almost plays the master in a manipulative role of the figure of Manfred.
And that's actually one of the things I love about the sidebar here, is that it's really, you really see Manfred sort of placing his own arrogance in his understanding of Arkhan. If I may quote, this is Manfred's thoughts, and he says, "How he hated the desiccated creature before him. Arkhan's history was one of defeat and groveling servitude. Now he came to Sylvania demanding to be treated as a conquering lord, or even as an equal. It was unthinkable. It was beyond arrogance." And I think this shows two things in the word choice here. First of all, I think it shows how Manfred sees the world. He's so self-absorbed, he sees the world around him as if it were a reflection of himself. Wherever he sees power, he sees the same arrogance that he possesses. But two, I think it's interesting, the line, demanding to be treated as a conquering lord or even as an equal, as if to be an equal to Manfred is to be greater than a conquering lord itself. And it gives you the barest glimpse of Manfred's opinion of himself. He is greater than a conquering lord. And it's just very simple language, but it reveals so much about these characters.
And Josh, if you look then later on, because Arkhan very shortly after that also gets a sort of internal monologue, and where you have his internal thoughts, and he says, "He had not come to Sylvania in search of an ally, but in need for a cat's paw, some trinket. Matters were coming to a head, and he alone could not achieve all that needed to be done." And so right there is Arkhan openly admitting to himself, like, there's a humility in that statement, right? He knows he is not great enough to achieve everything that needs to be done, and so seeks out assistance. And even if he's not, willing or not, as it were, or however he can get it. But there's an innate humility to the character of Arkhan that has probably served to keep him alive for 3,000 plus years that he's been around. And it's a wonderful comparison between somebody like Manfred, and you consider the other masters that he had, or powerful equals in people, like his relationship with Vlad in the past and things like that.
Okay, so now that we've established this uneasy alliance between these two figures, then they go on to reveal what is to come out in the plan. So Manfred, for his own desires and sakes, has already done a lot of legwork in advance and gathered, as we said, these the severed hand and the crown and the books of Nagash. So he brings Arkhan into his inner sanctum and reveals all these things to him. He also has gathered a couple of other key components, I guess, for lack of a better word, but these are living components. So he has trapped Volkmar, the Grand Theogenist of the Empire, who went on some crusade into Sylvania on himself, hoping that he would smash Manfred down, but obviously that was impotent. And then he has his two other prized captives, one which we talked about earlier from the perspective of the elves, and this is the Everchild Aliathra. And we also made mention of the other prize that he holds, and that is the Fey Enchantress, who was given over to him by the Dryad Dricha, taken from Bretonia. Now, with all of these pieces assembled, that leaves 3 items that this odd couple needs to go and collect. One being the Staff of Nagash, which is to be held and found in La Maison Tal in Bretonia. The second being the Armor of Nagash, which is in the Armory Hold of Heldenheim, which is in the nearby province of Talbotland. And then the last item being the Fellblade, which is held by the Skaven, of course, who were the last to slay poor old Nagash openly, using the Fellblade to do so. So off they set in separate directions, and we'll maybe take the path of Arkhan towards Bretonia first off. So Vince, would you like to lead us into that tale?
Absolutely. So when we pick up with Arkhan heading into Bretonia, he's heading back into familiar territory. What's important to remember about this particular piece of the puzzle is that Arkhan has already spent a lot of time in Bretonia. He was there helping, I'm going to say his name wrong, but Malubad or whatever, the false son of the king, or the false king, whatever you want to say, sort of festered this civil war. He was kind of playing puppet master already and working very hard to bring Bretonia low and weaken it to serve his very down-the-road ultimate ends. So he doesn't really encounter much resistance that stands in his way as he plows forward into this sort of broken land. The other notable piece of his journey is that he goes ahead and collects 2 more sort of pawns or tokens or allies, however he sees them, along the way, in the Lichmaster Kemmler and in Krell. And so obviously both of them have, purposes to serve for Arkhan here. And so the 3 of them sort of head to this abbey and have this confrontation at La Maison Tal. And that leads us to then the 12th battle of La Maison Tal, as there had been 11. This is a sort of abbey that holds a great number of sacred artifacts and treasures in the realm of Bretonia. And 11 times before, people have tried to come and take them, and now this will be the 12th, and probably final time given where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what I recall about this, and one of the things that's an important note, is that as an escort, Manfred offers up legions of undead to trail along behind Arkhan. He says, no, it's all right. I can just go it on my own. I'll raise up any armies that I need along the way. I have it in the works. But he absolutely insists to give him an escort of his Drakenhof Templars to accompany him. Now, of course, Manfred's nefarious ideas here is that he's keeping an eye on Arkhan, is what he's really doing, by sending one of his trusted vampire colleagues to trail along with him. And this comes up in a little bit of a snippet later as some significant relevance to what Manfred's really thinking behind that. Now, of course, his motivation, as you pointed out, traveling through the south of Athel Loren to go through the vaults, is to meet up with Kemmler, who he still recognizes as a very formidable necromancer and a good handle on raising the undead. So he would use him for the ultimate assault on Maison Tal. Okay. Leading up to this, Josh, do you have any thoughts on what the poor Bretonians have to deal with once again, after they've already been so heavily beset leading up to this?
Well, it does seem that the Bretonians are being overwhelmed, but the interesting thing that I was kind of making note of for a moment is the actual objects that are coming from each area. Um, in Alakanash, the staff of power, the staff obviously being a symbol of wisdom and learning, and particularly in this case magical learning, I find it interesting now that they have, in this story, they have broken the martial power of Bretonia with the Civil War. Now the forces of darkness are striking at its spiritual side, at its learning, at its magical strength, and it's just this constant erosion of the former might of Bretonia in this assault on the Abbey.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting way to put it, much more deeper than just rubbing salt in the wounds that are already there. And I agree, it's further than just an erosion of their populace, but of their fabric of society as this goes along. It's very tough to recover from. Which is a good segue into a prime character representing the Bretonians here, of Duke Theodric. And they have a little snippet of a tale about Theodric where they present him as a lord and master of his own fiefdoms in the past that sort of fell upon a poor way, and he became known as a drunkard and an abuser and all around just a poor fellow. And he was assigned, with a little bit of shame, to just be the master of La Maisontal and the garrison that was kept there. So not entirely stripped of his dukedom, but he just didn't have an active role in it because of these other past regressions, I suppose. So it may be that he's kind of a representative of what's happening to Bretonia as a whole, and then it's not as proud any longer. It's tarnished and eroding, as you put it. Okay. Well, perhaps we jump ahead to the battle itself, because the build-up, as you said, this is the 12th Clash at La Maisontal. It's kind of hard to fathom how something still holds on after 11 assaults on it, but apparently it's been rebuilt a couple times along the way, and still is the place to be in Bretonia if you're an unholy relic of some sorts, and you got to find a place to live. That's where you get tucked away. So
well,
throughout
one quick note as we lead up to the battle is just I wanted to point out that I do love when they go through in this, as they set up the battle, they sort of give you an overview description of the people taking place, and of course you get the Duke or you get Theodric and his and Duke Jared, and I think that you're right in pointing out that there is a sort of metaphor for larger Bretonia, and honestly I think it's the two of them. Because one of them is really what Bretonia is. It is a drunken, lecherous, debaucherous place where the knights abuse those beneath them. But it is also an honorable, proud, courageous knight in Jared trying to avenge their fallen friends. I think it's both of these things, and the reconciliation of those two halves has always been the challenge of what is really the soul of Bretonia. And yeah, you see that in those descriptions. The only other thing I would point out is that the Rapscalliards is the best name for a men-at-arms unit I have ever heard, and would absolutely call one of my own units that if I ever found it.
I
Totally agreed. I actually want to draw something else about the Rapscalliards out. I know last time we were discussing the hopefulness of the Bretonians and their write-up, and I agreed with you at the point, but the last sentence and a half or two sentences of the Rapscalliards rundown takes all of that hope and just rubs it against a broken wall. And I'll quote, it says, "For their part, the men-at-arms of the Rapscalliards hated their duke as only aggrieved commoners can, and would have happily deserted, save for the certain knowledge that their lot would have been little better elsewhere in the realm." Which I think goes to show how horrible the life is for the peasants of Bretonia, in that they can imagine nothing better than being forced to their deaths against the forces of the undead. there is no brighter star for the commoners of Bretonnia there, and that's just depressing as hell.
Yeah, what a blind obedience that is, isn't it? It's sort of like a dog that gets beaten every day, but you still feed him at the end of the day so he stays around. Right. So as we get into the battle, Kemmler does his job of rising up as much undead as he possibly can to throw and batter the buildings. The Bretonians do their best to pray to the lady and line up their bowmen and knights to guard the assaults. And they set up some sort of flanking maneuvers with Theodric on one end and Jared on the other. There's one point where the battle sort of comes, and there's a build-up to it, and it reaches its crescendo where Arkhan finds himself in an isolated spot in the battlefield, and he is chanting away and re-raising undead and bringing up dead knights to fight against their former comrades, etc., etc. But Theodric gets to him, and he actually cleaves him with a mighty blow of his axe right through the spine. Arkhan doesn't see it at all. And just as the axe blow is about to fall again and take Arkhan's head from his shoulders, in comes Drakenhof Templar, who's been put in that position by Manfred to be Arkhan's minder, so to speak. I believe the man's name is Anarch von Karstein, so he is a cousin, I suppose, of Manfred. So he comes in with, and they describe it as moving with supernatural speed. He parried the Duke's death blow and unleashed a ferocious strike of his own sweep. Theodric was knocked from his saddle, and Arkhan rose to his feet once more and saw Anarch hack the Duke's head from his shoulders and realized with distaste that he now owed debt to the Von Karsteins. Unnoticed at all, Theodric's axe fell to the ground. With his death, the enchantment had fled, leaving it as mere metal. So, bit of a juxtaposition here, I think, that Arkhan all along knew that Manfred was planting this Anarch and his followers with him to sort of make sure that perhaps Arkhan didn't make it back. And he talked about this a little bit earlier, but here he is saving Arkhan from coming back. What do we think of this?
Well, I think it's interesting.
I love the scene. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting in two groups and two armies that are typically known for their sort of lack of individual initiative in terms of the mindless servitors of the undead. That they've managed to take this little part and kind of layer in potentially some questions of doubt and loyalty here. What you have to ask from this is, why did Anarch von Karstein make this action? Is it because he understands the long game that Manfred is playing, or is there potentially some confused loyalties there? Are there members of the von Karsteins who would willingly follow Nagash? And so it's added some complexity to what is already a thorny story, and I thought that was fabulous.
Well, and the reason that I think the doubt is there is because they do talk about the Vampire Society with the von Karsteins and otherwise, that they're not unlike any other kind of nobility where they're all looking to grasp a little bit of an extra step on that ladder, right, as they climb up in the society and become more important. So Manfred even mentions that at some point that there is always a little bit of a threat from these close von Karstein cousins, that they're always ready to usurp him.
I agree. I think that Anarch's actions are quite sensible here. He knows what Arkhan is and what he can promise, especially if Nagash comes back. If you had a chance to save that person and have that ace up your sleeve, well, why would you not do that? That is a heck of a card to pull later. First servant amongst the greatest and most powerful being that would roam the world, you now have in your pocket to some degree, and have a ready and willing card to trade in. Of course.
Now that's a very interesting comment, and perhaps my thoughts on this have fled me. But when later on in the book, if we'll look further, is Anarch von Karstein mentioned again? As I find it interesting that they would set up this sort of debt owed, and then when it was time for it to pay out, when Nagash himself comes and returns with power for those who served him, I don't recall Anarch actually receiving the benefits of his action here.
No, he does come up at a little point later, and I'll bring that up when it comes to pass. But for the moment, I maybe don't want to reveal that just yet. Right. So moving on from here, with Theodric's fall, he was the garrison leader of Bretonnia. Things start to crumble for the Bretonians, and it really looks like it's heavily weighted in the undead way, like we always knew it would. But here's the point where Arkhan, after he sort of knits himself back together after receiving a near-death blow, recognizes that Kemmler's not where he expected. And Arkhan is able to make his way into the Abbey itself, wherein he finds Kemmler clutching a hold of the prize that they've both come there to claim. There is a little sidebar snippet about this exchange where Kemmler reveals that, well, Arkhan, I'm here for myself, and I have the staff now, so I'm in charge, and I'm going to serve the gods that are true, not Nagash, but he references that he's under the sway of the Chaos gods, has been for a long time, and that is who he's come to claim this prize for. Okay. So for you fellas, are you familiar enough with Kemmler's history to know of this association, or did this come as a surprise to you?
No, I was aware of it. As they in the Vampire Count's book, it specifically kind of denotes how he was serving them after his last most heinous miscast reduced him to basically a babbling idiot. The Chaos Gods returned him to his great power in exchange for his service. The interesting thing here that I want to point out, though, is Kemmler's take on Nagash and his ultimate aims. Because up to this point, we've only seen the plans of Nagash through those who have been loyal to him and those who would describe them most generously. And what he specifically says here, I think, is very interesting because it gives us our first glimpse of how the other powers of the world see Nagash. And he says, "What greater prospect do I have in Nagash's service? A future of mindless servitude in an unchanging world," Kemmler demanded angrily. "The great necromancer is a selfish child. Though assured of his power, he remains forever terrified that another will take it from him. He will not be satisfied until his is the only will in existence, for only then can he be safe."
Mm. Well, it's bold words. It reveals his loyalty, that's for sure.
And it's interesting, too, because I think it's the first time that we see a potential humanizing of Nagash. And you see, rather than just being this massive pillar of death and evil energy, you see that a lot of his actions may very well be coming from a very human insecurity. And again, I think it's just great how they can take in just one paragraph, layer all this extra meaning on what could otherwise be a very flat and uninteresting story.
Moreover, I think Kemmler is exactly right. I think that this is literally Kemmler actually giving you a perfect window into the mind of Nagash. It's meant to be his sort of personal insight. I think it's 100% true in the story. I think Nagash's perfect world is a world where he is sort of alone and everybody else, everything else, I should say, in the world is more or less an undead, mindless, or near mindless servant that sort of is slave to his will, never changing. I think that is his utopia and what he strives for, and I think Kemmler's right here to point it out.
Good. Okay, so at this point, once they're having this this head-to-head, it doesn't have a Gandalf versus Saruman kind of wizard duel description in the narrative, but the end result of it is that there is a lot of fire and brimstone that's flashed around and can be seen from a distance from outside Mannfred, and then a horrendous explosion as the abbey itself just fires stone and rock and debris in every direction. Le Mannfred is utterly destroyed by this sorceress duel. In the meantime, Krell is mopping up the remainder of the Bretonnians outside of the gates. And in the last bit, the fire-blackened figure of Arkhan finally emerges from within, with the staff of Nagash in his hands.
Mm-hmm. There's actually one. No, you go ahead, Vince.
Okay, I was just going to say yes. It's a very nice and one of the small beats that I particularly like is that Duke Jared, the sort of sub-commander of the Bretonnians, is intelligent enough to not throw his life away and sees that there's nothing else to be won and calls the retreat. So actually some Bretonnians do survive to fight another day. And we all know for a Bretonnian knight to call a retreat is no small thing. And so I very much like that. And yes, in the end, you also set up this very, very big repetition they're going to play on through the rest of this chapter, which is the final sentence, which is the Nagash would rise. And they're going to continue to sort of riff on that theme as we move through.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things I actually want to expand on the paragraph right before that, and I think it demands being noted because it talks about how the abbey at La Mannfred was destroyed, and I think it's very important to note how descriptive it is. Because with a lot of these writings, I mean, they described the destruction of 2 entire countries earlier in the book in a sentence. But they go through this talking about in what order the various parts of the abbey are destroyed. And I think it's very interesting because it leads up to the reason why Duke Jared chose to flee the field of battle. And I think it's very much a metaphor for the systematic dismantling of Bretonnia. It specifically starts that the great expanses of stained glass, which dated back to the days of King, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. Guillaume. Fragmented under the irresistible pressure from within. So what you're seeing there is the history of Bretonnia being shattered by the pressures from inside it. That led to the civil war they've been dealing with. And razor-sharp shards sliced across the fields, shredding living and unliving warriors alike, showing the loss of life from that civil war. Then we see the entrance of the undead power, the green fire that came soon after, gouting through the gaps in the stonework, i.e. the hole that had been made in Bretonnian society from those shattered windows. And an eye blink later, the walls themselves, the last protections of the realm, shattered and burst outward. Long had those stones stood. They did not yield easily, but yield they did. And it's that, seeing what is very easily taken as the dismantling and ultimate destruction and loss of his country at the hands of these powers, is what really, I think, makes Duke Jared leave. He realizes that Bretonnia itself is at risk, and he cannot. It is greater than one man's life, and so he must pull back. And I thought it was just a very powerful paragraph.
I do agree. It certainly has ways of you thinking it as casting back on the history of Bretonia. I also want to I don't want to dwell on this, but I want to make a point that there's always has been a little bit of undertone of undeath in Bretonia. I believe the country's name was Mousillon, and this was one that years and years ago, ages ago, one of the lords of Mousillon had turned to necromancy and undeath, and he himself once was a vampire, and dwelled under that for a while before he was eventually found out and thrown out by the rest of his Bretonian fellows. But not before that seed had been planted.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. So, let's take it from here then. So the quest is achieved from Arkhan. He has done his job of retaining Alakanesh. But before we walk away from this little exchange, let's think about Kemmler for a second. Now let's think about, and maybe this is the first time we'll talk about deaths, real or perceived, in the end times. Do you get the feeling that this is the last you'll see of Kemmler?
I would give it, while I'm not willing to say 100% one way or the other, I am more willing to give this credence than some of the following deaths, if only because we're being told this information basically from Arkhan's point of view. And strangely enough, at this point in the story, Arkhan is really one of our more trustworthy narratives. Were it switched around and it was Manfred making this proclamation or this announcement that the traitorous Kemmler had been disposed of, I would doubt it a little more, because we've already been shown how he can be led away or led astray by his ambition and arrogance. But so far, Arkhan has been trustworthy. I think the simplicity of his service at this point in the story, at very least, allows him to see things more clearly. So I'm more inclined to believe that Kemmler is gone here.
And good riddance, I say.
I hope he can. That's what I will say. But all things are possible through the ever-giving gifts of chaos.
Indeed. All right. So there's a couple of quick points that I want to make. There's not a lot of story that describes Arkhan's return trip. He takes it through the pass of Paravon, Grey Mountains, and spends a lot of time in the Great Forest as he makes his way back through the Empire with just his escort. There's a couple of quick things that happen along the way, and this actually is really only described on the couple pages where it shows the map of their quests, is where this comes out. So there's a couple of key things that happen along the way. One is that they are opposed on the northern borders of Athaloran by Orion in his wild hunt. But Arkhan leaves it up to Krell to take care of this while he carries on. So he effectively leaves Krell with the bulk of the undead army to handle all that business, while Arkhan scurries away with his Drakenhof escort back into the Empire. And that's really all it says about that, and that's where it leaves Krell at that moment in its storyline. There is another point that I wanted to bring up, and this is back to what we said about Anarch. And this is the last point that he's mentioned. Betrayal at Beecher Vast is how it's labeled, and it reads like this. Anarch von Karstein, commander of the Drakenhof Templars, attempts to destroy Arkhan and reclaim Alakanesh and Manfred's favor. Arkhan defeats the would-be assassin and leaves him manacled to a gatepost at Beecher Vast Sigmarite Temple. So that's where that fella's business comes to its narrative conclusion. Anarch von Karstein. As we touched on before, Arkhan was always aware that betrayal was in the works, so he was well prepared for this. And so casting our discussion back to where we talked about Anarch a moment ago, you can only assume that his loyalties were always with Manfred, but in that moment where he saved Arkhan, It was really only just because the job wasn't done yet. And he needed Arkhan to follow it through and obtain that staff before he would act.
I find it very interesting here, and this is actually the first time I've taken note of this particular passage. I find it very interesting that Arkhan did not destroy his would-be assassin, and that he merely left him manacled to the Sigmarite temple. And the thing that I find interesting about that is now with the other books, the Glotkin, the Cain coming out, that we know that these stories are happening concurrently. It wonders at Anarch's ultimate fate when very shortly after that the Van Karstein family and the Empire will be sort of pushed into allying themselves together. I find it very telling that they didn't just kill him definitively there.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know what the motivation is there. You would sort of hope that Arkhan would want to make a lesson out of unraveling Manfred's, or so he thought, wild schemes in putting an assassin in his midst, and show his dominance over Manfred's ideas and his wills. I mean, if I were Arkhan, I would want to drag that guy back all the way to Sylvania with me and present him at the feet of Manfred once they meet face to face again. So I agree with you. It's a bit odd that he just leaves him there to a gatepost in some distant part of the Empire that has nothing to do with the Von Karsteins in the first place. But anyway.
I'll take this view of it. I think it was Arkhan the Black's Zorg moment. So we all remember Zorg from the Fifth Element, and the priest knocks the cherry out of his throat and saves his life. And so Zorg, this sort of embodiment of ultimate evil, says, "You saved my life, so I'll spare yours for now." And that's sort of like, I think that's what Arkhan is doing here. You know, you saved my life, so I'll give you a shot. You get this head start. If you can get your way out of this bad situation I leave you in, hey, good on you. Enjoy the rest of your immortality. Don't cross me again.
So you're imagining that Arkhan has some sort of conscience for his fellow undead.
I don't know.
Some slight bit of humanity. He must.
I don't necessarily know if it's a slight bit of humanity that he has, as much as it may be his sense of honor. The same sort of honor in him that maintains his loyalty to Nagash, I think compels him to pay back the debt that was accrued when the Van Karstein saved his life.
Sure, we can buy that. As an honor perspective, I buy that. Okay, so let's finish up here with a bit of Arkhan's saga. So he traipses through the Great Forest most of the way, and he does have a few skirmishes with beastmen, and this is a rare beastman encounter in the end times, and they simply explain it as led by Malagor, who is a great shaman in touch with chaos, seems to be drawn to the strength of magic that is being roused by Alakanesh and it traipsing across his realms. So, in a way, Arkhan, who is now traveling pretty much on his own, now that he's dispatched the Drakenhof escort and left Krell with the bulk of the undead army, is having to dodge beastmen along the way as he makes his way back to Sylvania. We'll maybe just leave that thought there for a bit because the beastmen will play a little bit of a part. But let's just keep that in our minds that the beastmen are trailing the power that is within that staff and are sort of following the scent of it, if you will. So at this point, gentlemen,
and I believe this is the first point where Arkhan realizes that there is another player on the field, right, who is moving against him he was not sort of previously aware of, as he looks back at the various sort of artifices that have happened, and he sees the hand of chaos at work, and in various ways, even going back to his time in Bretonia, before this story began, and seeing that things went wrong even when he wouldn't have wanted it to happen. And behind that, he starts to see this web of the Chaos Gods moving against him in a subtle fashion, and sort of he becomes more aware that they are also moving to stop Nagash.
Well, maybe on that, I will just come back to a thought here, and there's a passage that reads like this, and that is, the Lich Master's last words were often at the forefront of Arkhan's mind. Kemmler's implication had been that his treacherous actions had been carried out at the behest of the Chaos Gods. At the time, Arkhan had dismissed those words as the boast of a triumphant braggart. He had not believed that the Dark Gods would seek to intervene so directly in order to prevent Nagash's return. But intervene they had, and not just through Kemmler. The final part of Arkhan's journey to Castle Sterniesti had taken him through the Great Forest, and it had seemed that every chaos-touched beast had been drawn to his path. A lesser being than Arkhan would have been deceived into thinking the creatures had merely been lured by the Alakanish's power, but the Lich had not been fooled. A grim intelligence had guided the beastman to his trail.
I think this. I think that particular part strikes me as very amusing, because I think it's the first time we see some limitations in Arkhan, in him not focusing on who his enemies might be. I mean, in the writings of the Warhammer world, the four Chaos Gods are not far from the doings of mortal kind. The Warriors of Chaos existing is proof enough of that. And for him to just assume that they would allow a power like Nagash to come back without some sort of answer or response to it, I think it's a little naive for him. And so we see the first kind of chink in his armor there.
Yeah, indeed. You think of him initially as the master that knows all of the permutations and all of the possibilities. But here he is presented finally with a thought that there might be some other random factors that he has to deal with along the way. Well, let's move on and we'll talk about Manfred's path in all of this, and much to our good colleague Vince's happiness, it involves his beloved Skaven through this. So perhaps you can take us through the opening steps of this trail.
Happy to. I am happy to recount the story of this great tragedy amongst my people. A Pearl Harbor-like incident where we were attacked without provocation, completely ridiculous in its scope. One of our sacred artifacts stolen from us. Yes. All right. So, yes, exactly. Manfred sort of heads down, and he's going to retrieve the Fellblade to get this very powerful sword that had slain Nagash last time he was risen. And so his journey, most importantly at the beginning, takes him through the lands to the southwest of the Empire, so that's through Border Prince territory, what would be Tilia and Estalia. And what I particularly love about this is that we get a little bit more now of the description of the destruction of these Border Prince realms. It's absolutely fantastic. Manfred is shocked and aghast. The master vampire in this incarnation of death is taken aback by the utter destruction just sort of levied upon these lands by the Skaven as they have wiped them from the face of the map. And he gets in some fights with Skaven himself, and dispatches them very quickly, eventually interrogates them to figure out that they, what's going on. And after a series of, frankly, not very challenging battles for Manfred, he does eventually get himself down to Mordkin Lair, where Feskett has where the warlord of this particular area has the Fellblade hidden away, and that begins that big battle therein.
Now, this is a good moment actually to maybe show what the Skaven have been doing behind the scenes as this is all along, because does he not comment on how it seems utterly overrun by Skaven, and all he sees of any human activity is in the slave trains of the rat people.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he doesn't see any free people anywhere as he moves through those two lands. Like their conquering is complete.
Okay, so as you say, he arrives eventually through his travels and his clues to the entrance to Mordkin Lair. So take us through the opening salvos of this and what it ultimately leads to.
Yeah, so it begins with a lot of battles in the tunnels. So this starts with Manfred trying to work his way down through these tunnels into the actual lair. And, you know, the Skaven kind of constantly fight and flee before him, or, you know, they shove forward slaves and the rest of them flee. Skaven aren't exactly known for fighting to the last. And eventually they get down, sort of approaching the actual lair itself, and Feskett sends out Snickrat, his sort of most scheming lieutenant, the one who had tried to off him previously, and Snickrat starts just calling in all the warp fire throwers, and they're just bathing zombies in warp flame and burning them up, but it just, you know, it's all for naught. Manfred is able to sort of push on these undead endlessly. And this begins sort of a repeated theme throughout the battles of this book. You saw it in the Bretonnian fight, you see it here, and it's certainly going to become preeminent in the Heldenheim fight, which is just that you can knock them down, but they don't stay down, right? The undead come ever onward, and that absolutely ends up being sort of the doom of of Snickrat and the initial Skaven defense here, as despite how much they kill, as they're killing them, I think it says something like, you know, at a multitude to 1, which is impressive Skaven numbers. We generally die 5 or 10 to 1, but it's still not enough. And so really the vast majority of this battle does not involve Feskett or the Fellblade. He, in a very proper Skaven fashion, stays properly hidden inside the keep and sends out his troops to sort of do battle, sends out, you know, Jezzails and, you know, cannons and things like that to just sort of start blasting apart the undead. But eventually Manfred himself makes his way down a sort of a circuitous path upon a raised hill coming in from the side of the lair, and therein then starts the real confrontation and the end for Feskett and this battle.
Now, I think that I actually felt that Manfred was a bit of a Skaven warlord in a way in this, at least in the opening bits, because it's all about sending forth the zombies, and he just packs the tunnels with zombies. He keeps them coming and keeps packing them. It's not until they reach a point where there's a chasm to cross, the Skaven scurry across to the back side of it, and then shatter the bridge to keep the undead on the other side. They park a whole bunch of Jezzails and other missile troops on the other side and pick off any undead that come through there. And that's where Manfred first makes his appearance. And it's not until then. But it does show a little bit of ingenuity of Manfred here, because I'll pick up with this little bit. And that is that once they reach the brink and there is no bridge to cross, and Manfred's got no way to get through it, he begins to knit a bridge out of zombies, which I think is kind of fascinating in this fantasy realm, to think of that as a mortar in a way. He's turning flesh into a mortar for a bridge for his army to cross, and this just kind of, you know, surprises me, but it also sort of surprises the Skaven that this is happening, and they begin to panic and don't know quite what to do. Good piece of ingenuity, I think.
And I find that particularly...
And the last time we'll see the Skaven, or the zombie Lincoln logs in this particular quest that they're on.
And I find it particularly interesting in this fight when you compare his actions here, which are very methodical, very constructive, to his final fight with Feskett at the end, where pretty much all signs of his humanity and his forethought go away for pure savagery. And so I think it was very interesting showing both of those sides of Manfred within 2 pages of each other.
Well, and it also, to me, sort of shows a great power and majesty to Manfred for the first time, that he has this sort of mastery of the undead to that kind of degree. And then, and maybe to move it ahead a little bit, he finally does get to Mordkin Lair, and it's got all these walls built around it and a gate that's made out of the ribs of a dragon. And this again shows the mastery that Manfred has over the undead. And then he recognizes that within those bones is a bit of magic, because it is the bones of a dragon. And he exerts his will on that to reanimate this gate of ribs and dragon bones into a dragon in itself to fight on his side. So a massive mastery of power over the undead that I think is really shows quite impressively what Manfred's capable of. Okay. So now that we've gotten here and we have the face-off, I guess the final stretch to this. Tell us about your good friend and great General Feskett.
Well, Feskett a bit long in the tooth, obviously. He's getting up in the years, not as fast as he might have been. He's surviving mainly by cunning, and unfortunately, his cunning is good enough to keep other chieftain of the Skaven off of his back, but it's not the equal of Manfred's power, unfortunately, in this situation. He suits up, gets out the Fellblade, which he had drawn since he had a bad experience with it some time earlier, and decides he's going to march against his own sort of wants. Once he sees the ruin that has come to the realm, he suits up, grabs that sword, and goes out there and gets ready to kick some vampire butt. Unfortunately, we have perhaps one of the most anticlimactic fights within this entire book, as the old Skaven basically totters out and then sees Manfred, and then in a very cinematic fashion, Manfred disappears, appears behind him, and in the short order of about 2 moves, murders the poor senior citizen as he basically kicks Feskett's walker out from under him and then shoves his sword through his gut and kills him. Certainly not an honorable and appropriate end for such a great warlord, but such is it.
But I think it is an appropriate end for, as Manfred puts it, a 4th-rate leader of a craven race.
He was definitely a 4th-rate leader. I don't like that last part, though. Well,
those are certainly strong words. If you two were in the same room, I have a feeling I'd be pulling you apart at the moment.
No, he doesn't he's a Skaven player. He doesn't outnumber me enough to face me. He needs to go find 50 of his disposable friends to tie me up while he stabs me in the back.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, we learn a couple things about Manfred, I think, in this segment here, and I find that as a reader, I'm becoming a little bit more impressed by him, and maybe thinking he has a purpose for his arrogance. But anyway, the prize is claimed, and he makes his way back to Sylvania once again. What I was trying to find here in the narrative actually is where they explain the significance of the Fellblade and why it's a needed relic in the ritual for Nagash. But I do seem to remember, even if I don't find the passage itself, what I remember about it is that part of reclaiming Nagash as whole and to regain his full power, it's important for them to destroy the Fellblade because it was an item that had destroyed his mortal essence once in the past. So by disrupting that magic and dissipating the power that took that from Nagash, it cancels out any of that negative effect that it would have had on his partial soul. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
I think there's also an element of the Fellblade seeming to still contain some bit of the essence of Nagash from killing him. although it's not like a soul drink or anything of that nature, I think Manfred at one point speaks about how he can sort of feel the essence of that death blow. That such a powerful sword had killed such a powerful being, they couldn't help but sort of imprint each other in some lasting way.
Good. Okay, so now Manfred makes his way back to the castle in Sylvania, and he finds Arkhan already there waiting for him, with both of them having achieved their objectives. So now that leaves them with one final item to reclaim before they can do the full ritual of resurrecting Nagash, and that is Moroccan, or Morocane, depending on how you want to pronounce it. That's held pretty nearby, but they both agree that it would have been the hardest to obtain. Reason being is because it's held by an order of knights in Heldenheim, which, although is close by, is a superior defense, and they will have to put both of their combined efforts together to try to steal this away. Now, in devising their plan, it sort of unfolds in that Arkhan would advance through the forest, and he would raise up skeletons to assault the walls that surrounded the city itself. So Arkhan shows his power here and his command of the undead, even more so than he did at Mesental, constructing skull catapults and legions upon legions of skeletal warriors, bringing them up out of the grounds around there, and he launches the assault on the walls. We have a few players on the Empire side, the most notable name being Hans Liebdorf. And I don't know that it directly says here, but he's obviously got some sort of relation to the Mad Elector Count of Marius Liebdorf of great Empire fame.
It specifies that he is the brother to the Mad Elector Count.
Oh, yes. Okay, I missed that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So, do one of you fellows want to take us up from here and let us know about the opening events of this assault?
I can definitely take that. Obviously, we open up with Heldenheim being, for the most part, caught unawares. You definitely see the generalship of Arkhan and the forces of the undead being superior, as by the time the undead army is already making its attacks, Autocross, the commandant of the city's garrison, is still abed and half hungover. So you definitely see that in terms of leadership, the Empire is lacking to begin with. And you definitely get the feeling that the men of the Empire are a little out of their league here. When the skull catapults begin firing on the walls, it's killing handgunners and whatnot, and the cannons at Heldenheim react by destroying the infantry of the skeletons. So Autocross is having to sort of redirect them, making sure that they can deal with the significant threat. And it takes them a little while. They finally do start doing some significant damage to the skull catapults, but you're seeing just this, I think they refer to it as an unholy mass of troops that are moving towards them. And you get them to the point where it looks like the Empire is actually making some stands. Their handgunners are going off. Many skeletons are dying. And the skeletons just walk up to the base of the wall. And at this point, the Empire men are sort of laughing at what, okay, the skeletons can hang out at the base of the wall all day long. They're not doing anything. And then all of a sudden, the skeletons start climbing on top of each other and creating a a swarm of ants up the side of the wall, and the handguns are going off, and every battery is shooting at it, but the main cannons can't even draw a line at the base of the tower, so it's just not doing enough. And eventually, the undead start to swarm over the city wall.
Yeah, and this is a point where I feel that Arkhan is really showing off a bit of his will. As you said, the cannons burst out and they shattered a number of these catapults that were battering their walls. But in the matter of a few moments, Arkhan just wields his control of the undead, knits that bone back together, and suddenly the skull catapults are fully functional and hammering at the walls once again. And then he has the will to craft these skeletons, much like Manfred did with the bridge to Mordkin Lair, into making effectively a pyramid ladder that would get them up to the parapets of the towers. Very impressive stuff.
And so you find out as it continues on, Arkhan is obviously very pleased that both his bombardment and his attack with the skeletons is winning, but he actually reveals kind of his own thoughts that all of it is just a diversion to draw out the knights. And so as it goes on, he's kind of thinking, well, you know what, we're doing great, but if the knights don't get drawn out, all of this has been for naught. But a few short paragraphs later, you see the knights do give Arkhan what he wants, and it could have very easily been a very short wrap-up here. But Hans Leitdorf is actually given quite a bit of attention and shown to be different from his brother. He doesn't have sort of the mad battle lust that the Mad Count did. And so he is managing to keep control and as a single individual help kind of keep the lines together. Specifically what it says is the defenders of Heldenheim could have fallen to Arkhan's legions had recklessness overtaken them. But Leitdorf wielded the weapon that was his order with incomparable skill that day. And it's really, you're starting to get this idea that maybe the knights and the best that humanity has to offer is going to be enough to win the day. I mean, you're definitely getting some sense that the Empire is holding their own, and then come the Vargeists. The flying troops begin assaulting the walls. The dark power of the necromancers are releasing specters, and ultimately they're defeated by an air force that the Empire can't match. And so they're not overwhelmed man-to-man or in any sort of honorable combat. They're basically swarmed from the skies by Terrorgeist, Vargeist, specters, and overwhelmed, and eventually the forces of the undead do claim their prize.
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to sort of draw upon here as that sort of leads up is it shows the strategic planning that these two fantastic brains have come together with in Mannfred and Arkhan, I mean. So there is a snippet in the passage where Leitdorf himself felt no satisfaction, it says, as the trumpet sounded the charge of his knights. So what that leads you to believe is that he sort of knows that there might be something up, that this attack on his walls outside of the city might be a feint, as it turns out to be. So he's reluctant to pull his knights out of the keep itself and charge down there. But charge down there he does, because otherwise the walls are lost. Of course, that's the ploy that Manfred was waiting for all along, so that the keep would be emptied out of its defenders, so that his aerial assault would then have an easy time of going after what he needed. So it all comes according to plan, the grand plan that Mannfred and Arkhan had put together, and they leave poor Hans Leitdorf empty-handed at the end of it all. and a few of his captains to try to defend the scant garrison that's still left in that keep.
I think this is also the first time we see what is to come in sort of the combined, in mechanical terms, what's called the Undead Legion, but what is really the army of Nagash, right? Because you have Arkhan using a primarily sort of classic Cimmerian Tomb Kings, Nehekharan force to assault the wall, using skull catapults, using blocked skeleton infantry, the things he knows, to march forward and siege. Meanwhile, the sort of, as the sort of anvil, the hammer strike then comes from this very traditional Sylvanian force of specters and banshees and vargheists, these things that hunt from the sky and in darkness, that then come in, and you see for the first time the power that happens when you get these two forces together. They win.
Yeah, and there's one snippet here I wanna remain on Hans Lietdorf just for a moment. So after the deed is done, and Manfred has gotten his prize and he flies off, well, Arkhan retreats into the forest as well, and he draws his skeletons away, or he just leaves them there, I suppose, to create his rear guard while the Empire Knights mop them up. But when Lietdorf returns back to his keep and recognizes the failure, there is one point in here where he, because Manfred leaves a little bit of a symbol, recognizes who the identity of the perpetrator is. And I'll read this a little bit here. He says, "At least the identity of the perpetrator was clear. Indeed, it could hardly have been clearer. The cage is broken." Those were the words that Lietdorf had found daubed in blood on the wall of the inner keep. And this less than 3 months after the Supreme Patriarch had proclaimed himself the man who had caged Sylvania. So he's tipped off. He knows now that Sylvania is in fact not caged anymore, that Manfred has overcome what the Wall of Faith had intended to do. And as he storms around raging and calling vengeance that he would go into Sylvania to crush Manfred once and for all, then something very interesting happens on his doorstep. And that is that the beastman horns sound, again, drawn to the power and following around Arkhan like a scent hound, have come on the heels of the undead assault. So now this poor fellow has to deal with the beastman army on his doorstep after losing out to the undead. Immediately feel for this poor man.
And that's another great example of the unreliable narrator in action here, where we see Lietdorf say, "They had been drawn by the sound of battle," Lietdorf guessed, "come to pile further horror on Heldenham." And of course, as we learn later, when we get the point of view of Malagor, or whatever, the Beastman sort of chosen one, that is in fact not at all why they were here. They had a very specific purpose and screwed up. Like, they are here at this moment in error, and the humans unfortunately pay the price of Beastman, shall we say, uncontrollableness, basically.
Yeah, it does tip that off, and a couple times before, maybe we didn't mention, is that poor Malagor, who is the brains behind the operation, just seems to be completely not in control at all, because the Beastmen, they're still base Beastmen, and they'll just chase after whatever their fancy is. You can never rein them in. Well, such is the fate of the race of Beastmen, I suppose.
They're running around leadership 7-8. They're just going crazy. You can't control them, you know?
Yeah. All right. So, well, that brings us pretty close to the close of the chapter. The deed is done. The Arkhan and Manfred have achieved their goals and captured the last 3 items that they need. So let's maybe put a couple of overarching final thoughts maybe on this chapter before we go. And I'd like to call this little part of things our brilliance or balderdash moment. So I'd like to invite you fellas to maybe point out something within the narrative or the text that you thought was absolutely spot on or absolutely crap. So let's, Vince, did you have something in mind that you wanted to share, or Josh, would you prefer to start?
I will offer you.
Okay, Vince,
Okay.
have at it.
I'm sorry, which one of us was going first?
You go right ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I you.
You are more
Yeah.
polite than Canadians.
Right. So I definitely think the brilliance here is, I guess, for lack of a better word for it, almost the buddy cop situation that they're pulling between Mannfred and Arkhan. You get two such very different styles of leadership and different styles of personality. And as this story goes on, you get to see sort of each of them working independently, but you see them coming together in a way you would not have expected to be a sum greater than their parts. And so I think that is truly interesting because I think it ties in ultimately to the game in reassuring, as we were kind of talking about this as an allegory for what Games Workshop is doing. I think they made the story parallel that way of joining together the two armies, the Undead Legions. You're seeing two different play styles, and you're seeing them come seamlessly together. And being able to do that on two different levels, I think, is absolute brilliance on the part of the writers here. As far as Balderdash, I must admit I am somewhat partial to this. There was not much that stood out and that I railed against. I guess my only thing is, again, the naivety of Arkhan to be so surprised at the lack of intervention from the Chaos Gods. I mean, perhaps if we had seen any hint that the Chaos Gods restrained from intervening ever, that might have been a worthwhile feeling from him, but I think it just comes across as naivete presented as it is. So that would be my closest to a balderdash moment in this particular chapter.
Right? And Vince, any thoughts from you? What stands out?
First thought, I can't wait to see the buddy cop movie with Mannfred and Arkhan, where Arkhan is getting too old for this shit, and Manfred is grabbing a hostage and jumping off a roof. And when Nagash comes, I assume he would play the role of the angry chief who demands that Manfred turn in his badge and gun right now. You're loose cannon! All right. Now, back to this. Yeah, I have a couple. Brilliant. I love the Bretonnian chapter in general. I find the whole thing brilliant. I find the confrontation between Kemmler and Arkhan good. I love I love the plight of the Bretonnians, and I love the character of Duke Jared and sort of how he interacts throughout the fight. He is the noble side of Bretonnia, and I loved his portrayal. I loved the battle on the bridge. I thought that was brilliant. Between Arkhan and Manfred and sort of the initial scene setting. And I think Josh mentioned that earlier. He thought that was really good as well, and I completely agree. For all the reasons he pointed out, I think Josh's description of it and insights into it were perfect. Now, as for Balderdash, well, obviously the ridiculous murder of a poor senior citizen Skaven warlord is a bit of Balderdash wielding the Fellblade. But no, the real Balderdash to me, honestly, in this book, jokes aside, is the character. All of the enemies of the undead seem perennially shocked that undead can be raised. In a fight, they blow away or kill some undead, and then they're like, "But the undead rose." Everyone's, "Oh no! How did it happen?" First time with undead, folks. Last time I checked, they've been a constant thing in the world forever. How did you not know that skeletons can get back up after you blow them down, and so on and so forth? And they don't point it out as like, but never seen to this level. We've seen skeletons rise, but my goodness, this is tenfold the number that normally rise in the span of a few moments. No, they just say like, but skeletons stood up, and the humans were shocked that they could rise. I think they got there in the first place, folks. So I just find the portrayal of the humans who, and by the way, 2.5 of these battles, there was no wizards opposing Arkhan or Manfred, which is very clever. There's no Skaven Greyseer. There's no battle wizard at Heldenham. And the three sisters die about fairly early on in the Battle of Knights Hotel, meaning what we got to see here was these two ultra wizards just run slipshod on armies that had no opposition to them whatsoever. And what happens when you don't have magic? You lose.
Well, clearly, none of these opponents of the undead have ever played Warhammer to realize that you have to kill the necromancer first, and then you can win the battle. So
we'll those scramble checks.
Yeah, I have to put on some lessons in the Warhammer world. Well, for me, I want to say that my moment of balderdash is the same as yours, Vince. I think it very sad that poor Skaven warlord with the mightiest weapon ever seen in the Warhammer world just goes down so easily. But for maybe a mildly different reason, I just felt like there was a great tale of build up to that, and then it just in a snap of a finger, simply Manfred dispatched the guy. So I felt a little bit shortchanged by the whole story, that it just came to a rather sudden conclusion. Not that it was a surprise. Like, we all knew that Manfred was going to go there and he was going to kill that Skaven in some way or fashion, but it was just felt too simple. Anyway.
Agreed. No, I'm with you on that.
Let me actually present a counter argument to that. I think it was actually very appropriate for that to happen that easily, because what it's showing there is that these artifacts of power in and of themselves are not enough to stem the tide of darkness. I mean, what he specifically says in that time is he is afraid, or recognizes the power and would fear the power of the Fellblade, even though it is wielded by the fourth-rate leader of a craven race. So he understands the power of the item, but what is actually lacking there is the Skaven themselves. They are not strong enough to utilize that power, and I think it sets the undead and the forces that serve Nagash up to a higher plane, kind of ratchets up that level of threat, because they ultimately are able to use those items successfully to grant them the power that they need, whereas the mortal races can't at this point.
Well, good. So having a good, rousing discussion, I think that may bring our chapter revision to a close. Gents, do you want to say any final words before I refill my scotch and finish this up? Well then, we shall finish this up.
Happy holiday Christmas, and may Father Nagash leave you lots of undead presents under your tree.
Yes, cheers to you all for that. I think that perhaps we may switch to eggnog for the next one for the festive season.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, but thank you again to you two fine fellows. Thank you again to all of our ladies and gentlemen, viewers and listeners, and we shall reconvene for more as we follow up next time with more of The End Times.